Greetings and welcome to this first response that I'm making to your posts for week one. First of all, welcome to the New Testament Theology class. This is the first time I've attempted to teach it with this interactive sort of online or distance format for the first 6 or 7 weeks, and then just 20 hours of face-to-face time that we'll have in early March. Part of what I want to do always in the first week is to address the question of what is New Testament theology, which a couple of you raised in your autobiographical statements. You expressed a desire to learn some more about that, to be able to express what that is and was. And then after your reading from Matera and, what's his name? I thought most of your synthetic questions were very good and were engaging with some of the basic issues of New Testament theology, biblical theology. Let me just say a few general words that sort of cover the same ground as you're reading today for this week. New Testament theology, or biblical theology in particular, as separate from dogmatic theology, is often dated to the inaugural lecture of Gabler in 1787, in which he described biblical theology as a descriptive and historical discipline. He didn't use the words, at least the English translations that we have from that speech, to say that dogmatic or systematic theology was prescriptive and philosophical, but the contrast between historical and descriptive is with prescriptive. In other words, dogmatic or systematic theology described what it was a person ought to believe if they were a Christian, whereas biblical theology, in Gabler's view, simply described what the Bible described the faith of the people of God to be. Then right around the turn into the 19th century, you have the first publication of separate works in Old Testament theology and New Testament theology. And today, the disciplines of Old Testament theology and New Testament theology continue on, as well as, in some places, a biblical theology that attempts to be a descriptive theology of the whole Bible. Across the years, 19th century in particular, primary debate methodologically in biblical theology had to do with history and how history was done. And eventually the accusation by the end of the 19th century is that the thing passing under the title biblical theology, either Old Testament or New Testament theology, was not in fact theology, but history of religion. It was simply descriptive of the religious systems that you found in the Old Testament or New Testament. That was really the state of affairs as we encounter World War I, which in many ways is sort of intellectually considered the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, though it's a decade and a half into the 20th century. Coming out of World War I, you have, amongst other things, Karl Barth's famous commentary on the book of Romans. And in essence, Barth began the call again to a biblical theology that was descriptive but was actually theological. And most of 20th century has been involved in for lack of a better term, methodological debates in the two Testament theologies. Old Testament theology, quite frankly, has been more energetic, more engaged, and frankly more effective than New Testament theology has been in the 20th century. And Old Testament theology moved into the 21st century with a lot more momentum than New Testament theology did. I'm going to leave the Old Testament theology to the side at this point and talk a little bit about New Testament theology. The key figure in the 20th century was Rudolf Bultmann, whose New Testament theology came out almost exactly mid-century. And Bultmann had a particular understanding of the historicity of the New Testament accounts. He was ultimately more interested in kind of a existential philosophy, engaging with this, and yet he was also influenced by the dialectical theology of Karl Barth. And so Bultmann is trying to find a place out of the New Testament documents that he considers worthy to do theology from, historically reliable, that you can actually trace back to the people whose names are associated with. And as several of you noted from your reading, his focus ends up primarily on Paul and then John. He actually has some of the post-New Testament non-canonical writers in a final section in his 2-volume work on New Testament theology. Bultmann was the kind of person that almost everyone in the 20th century loved to either hate or agree with, and he was, and that's what happened. Nobody ignored him. You either fought him tooth and nail because of his question of whether Jesus really mattered for New Testament theology, whether there was anything you could know, which he said, no, you can't know anything about the historical Jesus. And so that kind of historical skepticism really was off-putting to folks that we might consider evangelical or conservative. And it was widely embraced by a large portion of sort of avant-garde people who were quite interested in some sort of religious experience without, and that seemed to not be bound up in questions of authority and Jesus and his claim. So it's the claim of the gospel, it's the claim of preaching on his life. But where New Testament theology struggled was over issues like, does Jesus belong in New Testament theology? The most common answer to that is no, because he didn't write anything. And if it's a theology of the New Testament, then how do you figure Jesus into that? And that's part of what you will be sort of engaging or up against in the reading for this second week, in which I have you reading a book that's essentially about Jesus, and then out of Matera, the Synoptic Gospels, because Matera doesn't give particular space to Jesus, the person, historically, his ministry. He comes at it through the texts that reveal that, the Synoptic Gospels. And that probably, in the reading you did for this past week, is the least covered of the kinds of basic issues that I think permeate New Testament theology. Several of you asked about the relationship or the functionability of New Testament theology in postmodernity, which I think is an excellent question. It's one of those places where New Testament theology's lack of agreement about methodology sort of handicaps it, because there are folks in certain kinds of New Testament theologies who are quite comfortable in a postmodern kind of context. There are others who have a more, if I can say this way, kind of a rigid definition of this must be understood before you can do New Testament theology, this must be accepted, that find postmodernity a less comfortable place in which to operate. So I hope you have some sense of the issues from your reading and from my sort of rambling comments here about the development of New Testament theology. New Testament theology from about 1975 to close to 2000, just there wasn't anything being published. There was theologies of individual books, individual authors. Cambridge University Press put out a series called New Testament Theology, but the books were little books: theology of Matthew, theology of Mark, theology of Luke, theology of John, theology of Acts, theology of major Pauline letters, theology of smaller or later Pauline letters, theology of the post-Pauline letters, theology of Hebrews, theology of Johannine letters, theology of the Revelation, all that sort of bifurcation. And a question that one of you raised, can you have an authentic New Testament theology that doesn't include the whole of the New Testament? Well, certainly that era was afraid to engage that question, because New Testament scholarship was essentially so overwhelmed by the diversity of the various witnesses, books, writers of the New Testament, that they could conceptualize no kind of coherence to the collection of the canon, New Testament canon as a whole, and so they just ignored it and tried to do New Testament theology in small pieces, which proved ultimately unsatisfactory. One of the ways around that is, and a very personally influential book for me, was Werner Kummel's New Testament Theology according to major witnesses, Jesus, Paul, John, which came out in the 50s or 60s, English into the 70s. English translation. And Kummel essentially said, we can't get our arms around the whole of the canon, but we can take Jesus, Paul, and John and try to develop a coherent picture there. Starting in the late 1990s and a little bit earlier in Germany, you begin to get whole New Testament theologies being published, sometimes in Germany with the title Biblical Theology or of New Testament, of the New Testament, or New Testament. And since then, there's been close to a dozen publications. Several of the German ones have become available in English. Stuhlmacher's just recently translated this past year. I received it in January, well, early this month in the mail. The newest New Testament Theology by Craig Blomberg. Any of you that have had hermeneutics recently with me are familiar with Klein, Blomberg, and Hubbard for the Interpretation of Hermeneutics textbook. This is Blomberg nearing the end of a long career of teaching New Testament. He, interestingly, has a fair section on Jesus and maybe a larger section on the Synoptic Gospels. And so that question of, and this is the way it was often phrased back in a previous generation, does New Testament theology include the preaching by Jesus or just the preaching about Jesus? And Blomberg, in the most recent, has tried to include both. But by and large, the majority of New Testament theology texts, and I tried to pick Matera as a middle ground of depth and breadth, have tended to try to touch every New Testament witness, but even Matera has not worked as hard as I'd like to see him work at trying to find a unifying theme or unity to the whole of all of those witnesses. Well, I'm pleased with your synthetic questions. They were working at what I was wanting you to work at, and you're thinking about questions of method and the definition and what's at work. As you know, some of those questions are ultimately unanswerable in any kind of for sure, this is right, nothing else is right form. But they are questions that I hoped, as you thought about asking them and thought about sort of how you might answer them, are ways that you're trying to put together these disparate pieces that are part of New Testament theology. The unfolding of this course will move through essentially Jesus and Paul and John and give primary emphases there. Just a little bit of attention to some of the theological themes that come in other writings toward the end of the course. Have a good week as you read Neufeld on Jesus. His work is a combination of, well, he deals with what you might properly call New Testament theology or the theological significance of Jesus, as well as historical and a little bit of literary, but primarily historical questions relating to Jesus. We can talk about that at the end of this week or next week. Have an excellent week. Thanks be to God.